Noak has one hand already on the latch when the sound begins. Not a knock. Something softer than a knock. A patient persistence. A tapping at the glass so light it could almost be mistaken for a branch moving in the autumn wind. Except there is no wind, and the window faces the garden, and the garden in this hour is still. He is in the middle of listening. His patient is speaking, and what she is speaking about is a dream she had the night before, a dream in which she was given a piece of jewelry, a golden scarab, an ornament in the shape of a beetle, ancient and iridescent, and somehow important in the way that dream objects are sometimes important, carrying a weight that ordinary objects cannot carry, because they have been borrowed from a deeper vocabulary. She is describing the color of it. She is describing the feeling of holding it. And somewhere behind Jung, at the window he has not yet opened, a small living thing is pressing against the glass. He turns. He crosses the room. He opens the latch. What comes through is a rose chafer, a Cetanea aurata, a European beetle whose elytra catch the light with the same green-gold shimmer as the scarab in his patient's dream. He catches it in his cupped hand. He holds it out to her and says quietly, "Here is your scarab." The year is sometime in the early 1940s, in Küsnacht, a small town on the eastern shore of Lake Zurich, where Jung has lived and worked for decades. The consulting room is familiar, books along the walls, a particular quality of afternoon light, the patient in her chair across from his, the careful distance that the analytic session requires. Nothing in the room is unusual. Nothing has been arranged. And yet the moment has the quality of something arranged, the feeling of two things that should have stayed separate, having been brought by no visible hand into an impossible alignment. The inner event and the outer event have coincided not through any chain of causes either person can name, but through something that feels in the room like significance. Jung wrote about this moment years later, and he chose it as his central illustration of a concept he had been working toward for a very long time. The concept was synchronicity. The illustration was not chosen because it was the most philosophically rigorous case he could find. It was chosen because it was concrete, and because something in it could be felt rather than merely described, and because the feeling it produced was precisely the thing he was trying to think about. The sense that meaning, rather than mechanism, had organized the convergence, the beetle and the dream. The moment when the outer world offered, without being asked, exactly the symbol the inner world required. What Jung was reaching toward had a name by 1952 when he published the essay that set the argument down formally. The essay was called Synchronicity, Tokens, Name an Acausal Connecting Principle, and its central claim was something that would have sounded simply wrong to most scientists of his time, and that still sounds difficult today. He was arguing that causality, the principle by which one event produces another through an unbroken sequence of physical forces, is not wrong. He was at pains to say this, because he knew how easily the idea could be mistaken for mysticism or for a rejection of science, and he did not want it mistaken for either. Causality, he argued, is not wrong. It is incomplete. There exists a class of events, he proposed, that fall outside its reach, events that are connected not by force, but by meaning, organized not by the mechanics of push and pull, but by a principle he called acausal orderedness, a kind of underlying coherence that does not operate through causes. This was a formal philosophical proposition, and it required, as formal propositions do, both the argument and the ground beneath the argument, the question it was trying to answer, the tradition it was departing from, the historical and intellectual context in which it arrived. The tradition Jung was departing from was Aristotelian and Newtonian causality, the view that every event in the universe is the effect of a prior cause, that the chain of causes is unbroken, that what appears as coincidence is always, in principle, explainable through a complete knowledge of antecedent conditions. This was not a view that one or two philosophers had held. It was the foundational assumption of Western science for centuries, the picture of the world as a vast mechanism in which nothing happened without a reason, where reason meant mechanical cause. The picture had been enormously productive. It had generated physics, chemistry, medicine, engineering, all the accumulated understanding of how forces produce effects, and effects produce further effects in the long unbroken chain that runs from the past into the future. Jung was not questioning any of that. He was questioning whether the chain was all there was. To argue that it was not all there was, he needed a different kind of evidence, not the evidence of experiments that could be repeated under controlled conditions, since by definition, a meaningful coincidence is unique, occurring once, in a specific context, for a specific person at a specific moment in their inner life. He needed a different epistemological approach entirely, and he found it, characteristically, not in a single discipline, but at the intersection of several. He found it in depth psychology, in the physics of his time, in Chinese philosophy, and in the practice of a divination tradition thousands of years old. The first of these intersections was the most surprising to the scientists who encountered it, Jung's collaboration with Wolfgang Pauli. Pauli was not a peripheral figure in physics. He was among the central figures, the architect of the exclusion principle that bears his name, the theorist whose work on quantum mechanics earned him the Nobel Prize in 1945. He was also, in ways his colleagues found harder to accommodate, a man who took dreams seriously, who had undergone analysis with Jung's student Erna Rosenbaum, who had been sending his dreams to Jung for correspondence and interpretation since the early 1930s, and who had become convinced that the division between inner psychic reality and outer physical reality was not as clean as either psychology or physics habitually assumed. Pauli was troubled by this conviction. It did not fit in the language of quantum field theory. It did not fit in the language of depth psychology either. It seemed to live somewhere between the two disciplines, in territory that neither had mapped. Over the years, the correspondence between Pauli and Jung accumulated into something unusual, a genuine intellectual friendship between a physicist who could not stop thinking about the soul and a psychologist who could not stop thinking about physics. What they shared was a dissatisfaction with the completeness of their respective disciplines, and a shared intuition that the divide between matter and mind, between the event in the laboratory and the event in the consulting room, was philosophically more problematic than the textbooks acknowledged. In 1952, the same year Jung published his Synchronicity essay, they published together, under a single title, The Interpretation of Nature and the Psyche. Pauli's contribution addressed the psychology of scientific discovery, examining the role of symbolic and archetypal imagery in the genesis of Kepler's astronomical work. Jung's contribution was the Synchronicity essay. The joint publication was deliberate. They were trying to locate a common ground. Pauli wrote to Jung in letters that described dreams unlike any he could take to a physicist, dreams of rotating figures, of world clocks, of symmetries that felt as though they belonged simultaneously to the mathematics of physics and to something else entirely, something for which physics had no vocabulary. He waited across the weeks of postal time for replies that arrived from a different discipline, in a different language, addressing a territory neither of them had a settled name for. What connected them, across the difference in their fields was the same unresolved question whether the meaningfulness that the psyche finds in certain outer events is a projection onto a neutral world, or whether it is a perception of something actually there. Jung did not think this was only a question for the 20th century. He had spent years reading widely in traditions that had been asking related questions for much longer, and among those traditions, the one that seemed to him most relevant to synchronicity was Chinese, specifically the ancient practice and philosophy associated with the I Ching, the classic of divination known in the West as the Book of Changes. His engagement with Chinese thought came largely through his friendship with Richard Wilhelm, the German sinologist, who had spent years in China not as an observer from the outside, but as someone who had entered into the living practice of the traditions he was studying. Wilhelm's German translation of the I Ching, published in 1923, was accompanied by a preface that Jung wrote with a particular kind of care, the care of someone who recognizes that the framework being described is not simply an exotic alternative to Western thinking, but a fundamentally different way of understanding what time is and what events are. In the Western view that Jung was departing from, time is a neutral container, a uniform, homogeneous medium through which events pass, each one essentially similar to every other in terms of the time structure it occupies. One moment is, from the point of view of physics, the same as any other, a point on a continuous line, interchangeable in its formal character with every adjacent point. What distinguishes events is their causal structure, the forces that produce them, not the character of the moment in which they occur. The moment has no special quality of its own. The Chinese philosophical tradition expressed in the I Ching assumed something quite different. Time, in that framework, is not homogeneous. Each moment has a qualitative character of its own, a particular kind of energy, a particular configuration of forces, a particular tendency. The hexagram that the I Ching reveals through the casting of stocks or coins is not understood in the tradition as a prediction of what will happen. It is understood as a portrait of the moment itself, a description of the qualitative signature of now, the particular shape of this convergence of circumstances, what the moment is like from the inside, what kind of action it is hospitable to, and what kind it resists. The event of the casting, the inner situation of the person who consults the oracle, and the hexagram that appears are all, in this view, expressions of the same moment. They belong together not because one caused the other, but because they are all the same thing, seen from different angles. Wilhelm sat with Jung in Zurich and described how the casting of a hexagram in a given moment had been understood in the living practice he had absorbed in China, not as a fortunate guess about the future, but as a reading of the present, a way of making visible the qualitative structure of a moment that ordinary perception would move through too quickly to notice. The hexagram, cast without any intentional guidance toward a particular result, was held to be coherent with the inner situation of the person casting it, not because one had caused the other, but because both were expressions of the same temporal signature, the same moment's character. Jung recognized in this an ancient articulation of the principle he was trying to formalize. The Chinese conception of time as qualitatively differentiated, as carrying meaning that is not imposed by the observer, but is already present in the moment itself. This was, he thought, a cross-cultural precedent for what he was trying to say with his acausal connecting principle, not a proof, not a scientific confirmation, something older and different, a tradition that had been living with this understanding for thousands of years, had built an entire practice around it, and had found it, over that enormous span of time, worth keeping. The formal argument that Jung set down in 1952 proposed synchronicity as the fourth of what he called explanatory principles, alongside energy, space, and time. This was a careful placement. He was not claiming to replace causality or to dispute the laws of physics. He was claiming that the universe, as actually experienced, contains a class of events that the first three principles are insufficient to account for, and that a fourth principle is needed not to override the others, but to complete the picture they cannot complete on their own. The events in this class share certain characteristics. They involve a meaningful correspondence between a psychic event, something occurring in the interior life of a person, a dream, a thought, a feeling, an image, and a physical event in the outer world, occurring at or near the same time, that is symbolically coherent with the inner event, but causally disconnected from it. The connection is not mechanical. No force runs from the dream to the beetle. No signal passes between the patient's sleeping mind and the garden outside the consulting room window, and yet they correspond. They correspond in a way that carries meaning, meaning that is not constructed after the fact, but that arrives in the moment of convergence as a felt recognition. Jung was careful about what he was and was not claiming here. He was not claiming that all coincidences are meaningful. He was not claiming that the universe arranges events for the benefit of individual people. He was not claiming that synchronistic events can be produced on demand or verified through repetition. Their non-repeatability was, he thought, precisely part of their nature. They are singular events occurring in specific contexts for specific people at specific moments in their psychological lives. Their meaning is not abstract or universal, but particular and personal, dependent on the inner situation of the person who experiences them. He was also aware that the coincidence of a dream and a beetle at a window might, in other circumstances, carry no particular significance at all. What made this specific event a candidate for synchronistic interpretation was not the rarity of the convergence in statistical terms. Beetles tap at windows sometimes, and people dream of beetles sometimes, and the overlap of these two facts in a finite time window is not in itself astonishing. What made it significant was the psychological context. The patient was at a critical moment in her analysis, stuck in a defensive rigidity that had resisted every ordinary approach. And the symbol of the scarab was, in the Egyptian tradition that underlies so much of Western symbolism, an image of transformation and rebirth. The outer event offered, at the precise moment the inner work required it, exactly the symbol that the inner drama had called for. This is what Jung meant by meaning as an organizing principle, not meaning in the thin sense of semantic content, a word that refers to something, but meaning in the thick sense of psychological significance, the kind that arrives when something in the outer world speaks directly to something in the inner world in a way that seems to require more than accident to explain. Whether it actually requires more than accident, whether acausal orderedness is a real feature of the universe or a way of naming a particularly striking accident, is a question Jung acknowledged could not be settled by his argument alone. He was not offering proof. He was offering a framework and proposing that the framework was worth taking seriously because the events it describes are real, even if their ultimate explanation remains open. The patient who received the beetle from Jung's hand was a woman who had, until that moment, been resistant to the movement her analysis required. She was educated, rational, defended in the particular way that highly rational people can be defended. Her psychological armor was made of arguments, of epistemological skepticism, of a relentless reasonableness that had kept her from the kind of direct encounter with the irrational that Jung's method required. She had been at the threshold of a transformation for months without crossing it, and then the outer world had done something unexpected. It had produced, without being consulted, the symbol that the inner work was calling for. What happened to her in the aftermath of that moment, Jung described as a breakthrough, though the word breakthrough carries a dramatic weight he would not have intended. It was quieter than that. Something had shifted. Something that had been held in suspension had become able to move. The armor that reasonableness had constructed was, for a moment, insufficient, not because it had been argued away, but because the argument had come from a direction no argument could have come from. The coincidence had done what the analysis had been unable to do, and it had done it not through force, but through meaning. This is the territory Jung was mapping, and the map he drew was unusual because it required him to work at the boundary of several disciplines simultaneously, to bring together depth psychology and quantum physics, ancient Chinese philosophy, and modern European thought, the consulting room in Kusnacht, and the letter arriving by post from Polly's desk in Zurich. He was not a tidy thinker in the sense of a thinker who stays within the walls of a single discipline. He was a thinker who followed the question wherever it went, and the question went into territory that disciplines by their nature have agreed not to occupy. At his writing desk in 1952, composing the argument that causality is not false but incomplete, Jung was working against a kind of intellectual gravity, the gravity of the assumption that had held Western thought together for centuries, the assumption that the causal chain, given enough time and knowledge, could account for everything. This assumption had tremendous authority. It had been productive in ways that no alternative framework had approached. To argue against its sufficiency required not audacity exactly, but something quieter and more sustained, the willingness to keep returning to a class of events that the assumption could not accommodate, and to take those events seriously rather than filing them under coincidence and moving on. The filing under coincidence impulse is strong. It is culturally enforced and intellectually respectable, and in many cases, it is exactly right. Most coincidences are coincidences in the ordinary sense, events that occur together by chance and carry no particular meaning beyond their accidental proximity. Jung knew this. He was not arguing for the meaningfulness of all coincidences. He was arguing for a class of events that are not exhausted by the statistical account, events in which the convergence is not merely temporal but symbolically precise, in which the outer event corresponds to the inner event in a way that feels like recognition rather than surprise. Recognition is different from surprise. Surprise is what one feels when something unexpected happens. Recognition is what one feels when something expected but not consciously anticipated arrives. It is the feeling of having known something without knowing that one knew it, of seeing something come into view that was somehow already familiar. This is what the patient felt when Jung opened his hand and held out the beetle. Not astonishment at the strangeness of the event, but a kind of recognition, the feeling that what had happened in the room was in some sense right, was a confirmation of something her dream had already known. Jung thought this feeling of recognition was itself philosophically significant. It was not a cognitive error, not simply the retrospective imposition of meaning on a neutral event. It was, he argued, a perception, a response to an actual correspondence between inner and outer, a correspondence organized by a principle that operates below the threshold of causal mechanism. Whether that principle is ultimately reducible to causes we have not yet identified, or whether it represents a genuinely irreducible mode of connection, is a question the argument cannot finally settle. Jung was honest about this. He was proposing a framework, not a proof. The framework has remained controversial, as frameworks that challenge foundational assumptions tend to remain. Scientists who encounter it note, correctly, that its core claims are difficult to test in any rigorous sense, since the events it describes are non-repeatable and their meaningfulness depends on context that resists quantification. Philosophers note that the concept of acausal orderedness is not fully developed, that a connection organized by meaning rather than mechanism still requires explanation of how meaning can function as an organizing principle without being reducible to something causal. These are honest objections, and Jung's defenders have not always answered them with the rigor the objections deserve. What survives the objections, and what continues to give the concept its staying power, is not its scientific credentials, but its phenomenological accuracy, its fidelity to a class of experience that most people have had at some point and found difficult to dismiss. The experience of the meaningful coincidence, the moment when the outer world seems to speak directly to the inner situation, is not rare. It is common enough that almost any honest account of a human life will contain several. What is rare is the willingness to take it seriously as a philosophical datum rather than explaining it away before the explanation has been earned. Pauli took it seriously. He took it seriously in the way that a physicist who has spent his life thinking about the relationship between the observer and the observed tends to take it seriously, not credulously, not with a suspension of critical judgment, but with the recognition that the question of what constitutes an explanation is itself more complex than it first appears. If the observer cannot be cleanly separated from the observed at the quantum scale, if the act of measurement is genuinely part of the event being measured, then the division between inner and outer, between the psychic and the physical, may be less absolute than the model of the universe as a machine of external causes implies. Pauli was not claiming that quantum mechanics proved synchronicity. He was noting that quantum mechanics had complicated the picture enough that a simple dismissal of the synchronicity hypothesis was no longer quite as easy as it once had been. The Yu-Ching was, for Jung, another kind of complication of the simple picture. Here was a practice that had been maintained, tested, refined, and relied upon across thousands of years of Chinese civilization. A practice based on the assumption that the outer event and the inner situation belong together in a moment, that the correspondence between them is not accidental but meaningful, that a properly attentive interpreter can read in the hexagram cast at a given moment something true about the moment itself. The practice had not been maintained out of mere superstition. It had been maintained because, in the experience of the people who used it, it worked, not in the sense of producing accurate predictions of the future, but in the sense of offering a symbolically resonant portrait of the present that the person consulting it could find genuinely illuminating. Willem had spent enough years inside the living practice to take its working seriously, and his encounter with Jung had the quality of two people who have been approaching the same territory from different directions and have arrived by different routes at the same question. Wilhelm from the side of a tradition that had been asking it for millennia, Jung from the side of a clinical practice that kept producing data the prevailing model could not accommodate. What they shared was the conviction that the relationship between inner and outer was not exhausted by the causal model, that there was something in the lived experience of human beings, recurring across cultures and centuries, that the model consistently left out. The rose chafer is still there, in the autumn light of the consulting room, in Jung's open hand. The patient is looking at it. Something in the room has changed. The air has a different quality. The session has moved into different territory. The defended rational structure that had held everything in place has found for a moment a gap it cannot close. The small green gold thing in Jung's hand has done what months of careful analysis could not by any force, not through any chain of causes, but through the gravity of meaning. Jung would later write that causality is not wrong, it is not false. It accounts for an enormous range of events with a precision and reliability that no alternative principle approaches. The causal chain is real, and its productivity as an explanatory framework is not in dispute. What is in dispute is whether it is everything, whether the universe as we actually inhabit it, the universe of inner lives and outer events, of dreams and beetles, of the letters Pauli wrote in Zurich and the ancient hexagrams cast in China, whether that universe is fully contained within the causal account. Jung's answer, held carefully and with full acknowledgement of its difficulty, was that it is not, that there exists at the margins of causal explanation a territory of events connected not by force, but by meaning, organized not by mechanism, but by a coherence that the mechanism cannot reach. He proposed this not as a finished theory, but as a hypothesis, as a way of taking seriously a class of experience that the prevailing framework could not accommodate, of holding open a space that the prevailing framework was inclined to close. To hold that space open requires a particular kind of intellectual patience, not credulity, not the willingness to believe anything, but the willingness to remain genuinely uncertain about the limits of a framework one has otherwise found reliable. It requires the recognition that a universe governed only by mechanism may be a smaller universe than the one we actually inhabit, that the causal chain, real and productive and indispensable as it is, may not be the only thread running through the fabric of events, that there may be another kind of order, quieter, less visible, organized not by force, but by something that functions more like resonance, or coherence, or the gravity of meaning, present in the world alongside the causal order, neither reducible to it nor incompatible with it, simply different in kind. The autumn afternoon holds still, the window is open, the patient is looking at the small green gold thing in the cupped hand of her analyst, and whatever has been held in place for months is very quietly beginning to loosen. The outer world has offered a symbol, and the inner world has recognized it. Whether that recognition names something real in the structure of things, or whether it names something real only in the structure of the mind that had it, that question remains. It remains as Jung left it, not resolved, not dissolved, but held open, like a window left unlatched, through which the particular quality of an autumn afternoon can continue, for as long as the afternoon lasts, to enter. Marcus Aurelius lifted his stylus in the dark of a military tent somewhere north of the Danube, and wrote a single word at the top of the page before he had decided what would follow it. The word was logos. He was not writing for anyone. The campaigns had gone on long enough that privacy had become the one luxury the empire could not requisition, and these pages were private in that absolute way, not hidden, but simply never meant for other eyes. He wrote the word the way another man might hold a stone in his palm before a long walk, not because the stone would help, but because the weight of it in his hand was steady, and steadiness was what the dark required. The Logos, the reason that moved through all things. He wrote it down and then sat with it, and the tent held the sound of wind outside, and nothing else. What Marcus Aurelius understood by that word was not a god in the usual sense, and not a force in the sense a physicist would mean, and not a law in the sense a legislator would mean, though it was something of all three, held together in a way that Greek philosophy had been working toward for several centuries before anyone called it by that name. The Logos was the rational principle immanent in the whole of things, not presiding over the cosmos from outside it, but running through it, the way grain runs through wood, present in the texture of everything, the reason why anything was the shape it was, rather than some other shape. The Stoics, who had inherited this idea from Heraclitus and carried it forward through Zeno and Chrysippus, and eventually to Marcus himself on his cold northern frontier, believed that the cosmos was not an accident. They believed that it was not governed by chance in the way the word chance usually means. What appeared to be chance, the meeting of two strangers, the unexpected reversal of a fortune, the dream that preceded the event as though it had known, was, in their view, the unrecognized surface of a deeper necessity. The Logos moved through all of it. The Logos had always been moving through all of it. Zeno of Citium had taught this in Athens in the early 3rd century, before the Common Era, walking and talking in the painted stoa that gave his school its name. He had arrived in Athens by shipwreck, the story goes, a merchant from Cyprus whose cargo was lost at sea, who wandered into a bookshop and found Xenophon's account of Socrates, and whose life turned on that hour in a way he could not have arranged. Whether the story is true in its details matters less than the shape of it, which is exactly the shape of a Stoic anecdote, the unexpected disruption that delivers a man to his real destination. If the Logos moves through all things, then even the shipwreck is ordered, even the lost cargo is part of the pattern, even the bookshop in Athens with its particular texts on that particular afternoon belongs to the structure of a rational cosmos, unfolding as it must. Zeno would not have said this with satisfaction, as though it were a consolation. He would have said it as a description. The universe is the kind of thing in which order runs deeper than it appears. That was the claim. It was a large claim, and it was made quietly, and it was lived with for a very long time. Chrysippus, who came after Zeno and systematized the school with a thoroughness that made the old arguments feel newly precise, pushed the Logos further into metaphysics than his predecessors had. For Chrysippus, the Logos was not merely an organizing principle, but a kind of divine fire, pneuma, breath, or spirit, that ran through all matter, differentiating it into the forms of things while remaining itself undivided. A stone had a low proportion of this rational fire, a plant had more, an animal more still. A human being, by virtue of reason, participated in the Logos directly, was not merely subject to it, but capable of aligning with it, of choosing to think and act in accordance with the rational structure of things, rather than against it. This was what virtue meant for Chrysippus, not a rule followed, but a harmony achieved, not the suppression of the world, but the recognition of its deeper shape, and the willingness to move within that shape rather than against it. What appeared as fortune, good or bad, welcomed or dreaded, was always for Chrysippus, the Logos arriving in a form the mind had not yet learned to read. This was the philosophical inheritance Marcus Aurelius carried on to the frontier. It had passed through Epictetus, who had been a slave, and who knew what it meant for external circumstances to be entirely beyond one's control, and who had extracted from that knowledge a philosophy of unusual severity and unusual peace. Epictetus taught that the only thing genuinely in a person's power was the quality of their inner response to what arrived, the assent or withholding of assent, the judgment placed upon events, the choosing of how to meet what could not be chosen. The Logos would move as it moved. Fortune would turn as it turned. The question was not what came, but what was done with what came, inwardly, in the only space the slave or the emperor equally owned. Marcus, reading Epictetus in the rare intervals of quiet that a military campaign permitted, found in this not despair, but something closer to relief. The cosmos was rational. The rationality ran deeper than his ability to see it. What he was asked to do was not to understand it fully, but to trust it enough to keep working, keep writing, keep returning to the page before sleep with the word logos at the top of it, a private orientation toward the dark. What the Stoics were not doing, for all their insistence on cosmic order, was eliminating the question of chance. They were relocating it. Chance, in their account, was not the absence of order, it was the name for order, not yet legible from where one stood. The philosopher Aristotle, who preceded the Stoic school, and whose influence on its development was deep even in the places where the Stoics argued against him, had taken a more careful look at chance than almost anyone before him, and what he found there was worth sitting with. Aristotle was working on his physics, working through the causes of things, why things are the way they are, what brings any event about, and he encountered the phenomenon of coincidence with what seems to have been genuine philosophical attention. He did not dissolve it into mechanism, and he did not call it miracle. He found it a category of its own, and he named it with two words. The first word was taike. Taike applied to deliberate human action, to the kind of event that happens when two chains of purposive activity cross unexpectedly. A man leaves his house meaning to go to the market for oil. Another man leaves his house meaning to go to the same market to buy grain. Neither has thought of the other, but at the market they meet, and the second man owes the first a sum of money, and the meeting occasions the repayment of a debt that might otherwise have waited months. Neither man intended to find the other. The encounter emerged from the crossing of two quite unrelated lines of purpose. Aristotle called this taike, chance in the realm of human intention, and he took it seriously as a genuine feature of the world, not a failure of analysis. The second word was automaton, spontaneity in nature without any purposive agent involved, the acorn that falls not because anyone threw it, but because the branch was weak and the season was right. Automaton was chance below the level of intention, pure spontaneous deviation from what happens always, or for the most part. What matters philosophically is what Aristotle did not do. He did not insist that chance events were, at bottom, fully causal and only appeared random due to incomplete knowledge. He left chance standing as a genuine explanatory category, something real in the world. At the same time, he placed it carefully outside the domain of science. Science, for Aristotle, concerns what happens always, or for the most part, the regular and the predictable, which meant that chance was real, but not tractable by the methods that give us knowledge of the regular. This was a careful move. It preserved the integrity of scientific inquiry, without pretending that the irregular, the crossing of unrelated lines, the unexpected convergence, did not genuinely happen. The man goes to market for oil. The debt is repaid. Neither man planned it. The cosmos did not plan it in the sense of intending it, and yet it happened, and it was real, and it mattered to both men, and Aristotle was honest enough to say, this is its own kind of thing. It fits into neither the deterministic chain of natural science, nor the free choices of deliberate action. It lives in the crossing. He named it, and then, as philosophers do, he left it there. Several centuries after Aristotle, in the 3rd century of the Common Era, a philosopher named Plotinus was living in Rome and thinking about what held the cosmos together. Plotinus had studied in Alexandria and then come to Rome, and he composed his Enneads there, his collected treatises, in a style that was dense and brilliant, and not always easy to follow, but which carried a vision of the universe so complete and so strange that it would influence Christian theology, Islamic philosophy, Renaissance magic, and eventually Jung himself, who found in Plotinus a world that looked, at certain angles, like the one his own thinking had been pointing toward. The key term in Plotinus was sympathy, sympathia, the idea of a cosmic sympathy running through all things, binding them together not through mechanical causation, but through a kind of participation in a single shared reality. Plotinus imagined the universe as a series of emanations from a single source. He called the One, not a God in any personal sense, but the absolute principle of unity, from which all multiplicity flows, the way light flows from the sun without diminishing it. From the One came nous, divine intellect. From nous came soul, the living principle of the world. And from soul came matter, the lowest level, the furthest from the source, but still connected to it by an unbroken thread of participation. The important thing is what this vision implied for the relationship between separate things. If all things have emanated from a single source, then separation is never total. The stone and the star and the human soul are not isolated units that happen to coexist. They are all expressions of the same underlying reality, held in the same invisible embrace. The sympathy between them is not a metaphor. It is a structural feature of what the cosmos actually is. This meant that events separated by enormous distance, or by the apparent gulf between inner and outer, between what happens in a mind and what happens in the world, could correspond to one another in ways that no chain of physical causes would explain, simply because they participated in the same living whole. A dream could correspond to an event. A thought could coincide with a word spoken across a room, not because the dream caused the event or the thought caused the word. The causal chain, in the usual sense, was not there to be traced, but because both arose from the same deep source, both expressions of the same world, soul making itself legible in the only language it has, which is the language of the particular. This event, this moment, this face at this window, at this time. Plotinus did not find this mysterious in a troubling way. He found it beautiful. It was what it meant for the cosmos to be one. Iamblichus and Proclus, who came after Plotinus and developed the Neoplatonist tradition further, made the practical implications of sympathia more explicit. Iamblichus, in particular, was interested in the practice of the urgy, ritual acts that could work with the sympathy of the cosmos rather than against it, tuning oneself to the frequencies of divine reality through material means. A particular stone, a particular herb, a particular time of day. These were not arbitrary, but carried qualitative signatures, resonances with higher levels of the cosmic order, and the person who knew which stone corresponded to which star, which herb to which god, could orient themselves within the living whole rather than stumbling through it blind. This looks very different from what we might call science, and it is, but it belongs to the same impulse as the scientist who insists that the universe is coherent, that it has a structure, that the structure can be read, the impulse toward intelligibility, the conviction that the world is not mere noise. Ancient Rome institutionalized this conviction in ways that seem strange from certain distances and less strange from others. The practice of augury, the reading of bird behavior as a disclosure of divine intention before military campaigns and civic decisions, was not the superstition of uneducated people. It was the official practice of the Roman state, carried out by a college of augurs who held one of the highest religious offices in the Republic, who observed the flight of birds within a marked sacred space, the templum, a portion of sky and earth designated for the purpose, and interpreted the direction, number, and behavior of birds as a text in which the intentions of the gods could be read. The sacred chickens, whose feeding behavior before a naval battle was considered a direct communication from the divine, were maintained with serious institutional care. What the practice of augury encoded beneath the specific form it took, which was particular to Rome and to Roman religion, was a cosmological assumption that has appeared in many cultures and taken many forms. The assumption is this: natural events are not neutral. They are not mere mechanism, mere physical process indifferent to human meaning. They are embedded within a meaningful order, and that order can in principle be disclosed. The bird does not fly at random in the temple sky. The bird flies within a pattern that a trained interpreter can decode. Whether the interpretation is correct in any particular case matters less, philosophically, than the underlying conviction that the world's surface is the surface of something, that beneath the contingent particular there is a pattern that is not indifferent to those who live within it. The augur standing in the templum, watching the direction in which the birds have chosen to fly, was asking the same fundamental question that the Stoic was asking with the word logos, and that Plotinus was asking with the word sympatheia. Is the cosmos meaningful, or is it only what it appears to be, a series of events happening to one another without concern? The Stoics had answered this question with the full force of their philosophy. Rome institutionalized an answer through its religious practices, and then history turned, as it does, and the Roman world gave way to the medieval world, and the question of fortune and meaning was taken up again by a man writing in a prison cell in the early 6th century, waiting for an execution he had no reason to expect would not come. Boethius had served the Ostrogothic king Theodoric as a high official, had been one of the most learned men of his time, a translator of Greek philosophy into Latin at a moment when that translation work was among the most important intellectual labors available. He had held office, had enjoyed the patronage of power, had been by most measures a successful man in a precarious world. And then he had been accused, falsely, he believed, of treason, and imprisoned, and given the long interval of waiting that precedes a state execution. In that interval, he wrote The Consolation of Philosophy, one of the most widely read books of the medieval period, a text that shaped how educated Europeans understood the relationship between fortune, reason, virtue, and the good for nearly 1,000 years. The Consolation is a dialogue. Boethius is in his cell, lamenting his fallen condition, when a figure appears to him, Philosophy herself, personified as a great lady, whose gown is inscribed with the Greek letters for practice and theory, whose height seems to vary between ordinary human stature and something that touches the sky. Philosophy rebukes him, gently. She has come, she says, because he has forgotten what he was taught. And what he was taught, through the course of the dialogue she conducts with him, is a view of fortune that is at once pitiless and oddly comforting in its clarity. Philosophy does not deny that Boethius has suffered. She does not pretend that what has happened to him is not genuinely bad by the standards of ordinary human life. What she does, instead, is speak in fortune's own voice, takes on the persona of fortune herself, and explains what fortune is and what anyone who received fortune's gifts was always implicitly accepting. Fortune speaks, in Boethius's text, with a directness that is almost brutal in its honesty. She says, "This is what I am. I turn my wheel. I take pleasure in the turning. I raise what is low and lower what is high, and that turning is my nature, and you knew this when you took what I gave. Why do you complain now that the wheel has turned against you, when the turning was always part of what you received? The high position, the wealth, the public honor, these were never yours. They were loans. Fortune's loans, given and recalled at the pleasure of a force that does not deliberate, does not hold grudges, does not play favorites. She turns because turning is what she does." This vision of fortune's wheel Blind, immense, indifferent was the image that stuck in medieval imagination and passed through the centuries that followed, appearing in manuscripts and cathedral carvings and poems, a great wheel at the center of human experience, with figures clinging to its rim as it rose and fell. The image is stark, but the philosophical argument behind it is subtler than the image suggests, and it is in the subtlety that the consolation actually lives. Because Boethius, through philosophy, was not saying that life is meaningless, that fortune rules all, that nothing we do matters. He was making a much more precise claim. Fortune governs the external goods, wealth, power, health, reputation, the things that can be given and taken by forces outside the self. Virtue, the inner goods, the capacity for reason, and the choice of the good, this fortune cannot touch. The wheel turns, and the body may be imprisoned, and the fortune may be reversed, and all of this may happen to a person, and is still the surface of their life, not its depth. The depth is the soul's capacity to choose how to meet what arrives. The depth is philosophy herself, sitting in the cell, refusing to be frightened. Boethius was working in a tradition. He had read Plato. He knew Aristotle. He had absorbed the Stoics more deeply than almost any Latin writer before him, and their influence is everywhere in the Consolation. The emphasis on what is truly in one's power, the distinction between the apparent goods of fortune and the genuine goods of virtue. The argument that the person who has found their center in reason is not destroyed by what the wheel does. But Boethius was also writing from experience rather than from theory alone. The cell was real, the accusation was real, the waiting was real, and the philosophy that arrived to him in that cell, whether as vision, as literary device, as the actual experience of a mind turning toward what it had always known, was being tested against conditions that most philosophical arguments are never tested against. What he found in that testing was not comfort in the ordinary sense. He was not consoled in the way one is consoled by being told that everything will be all right. Everything was not going to be all right, and the consolation does not pretend otherwise. What he was offered was something stranger and more durable, the view from outside the wheel, the philosophical perspective that could acknowledge the reality of what was happening, the injustice, the loss, the approaching end, without being constituted by it. Philosophy sits beside him in the cell and does not say, "Fortune was wrong to do this." She says, "Fortune has done what fortune does." And this is not the most important thing about who you are or what you can choose in the hours that remain. The equanimity she offers is not the suppression of feeling. It is the discovery of a ground beneath what changes, the still center of the turning world, which had been there all along, which will be there when the turning stops. The image of Fortune's wheel passed from Boethius into the long stream of medieval and Renaissance thought, and in that passing it changed its valence many times, sometimes a warning against ambition, sometimes a comfort to the fallen, sometimes a reminder that the proud should look over their shoulders. But beneath all its iterations, the philosophical core was the same. The wheel turns. The turning is not punishment, and not reward, and not evidence of anything in particular about those it carries. What a person does in the turning is their own. The Stoics had said this first, and more severely, the Logos moves through all things, and the wise person moves with it, not against it, and finds in that accord a peace that no external reversal can entirely undo. Marcus Aurelius had written the word logos in his tent as a reminder of exactly this. Epictetus had taught it in terms shaped by slavery, by the knowledge of what it means to have nothing outside the self that cannot be taken. And Boethius, who had lost nearly everything the world had given him, sat in his cell, and found that the tradition had been building towards something real, not a promise that the wheel would stop, but a description of what was available in the turning. Fortune, in the end, is not the opposite of meaning. That is the quiet point the tradition was making across all these centuries, through all these different forms: the Stoic Logos, the Neoplatonist Sympathia, the Roman Templum, the medieval wheel, the apparent randomness of events, the crossing of unrelated lines, the rising and falling of what cannot be held. These are not evidence against the cosmos being ordered. They are the surface of an order that runs at a depth the ordinary mind does not rest at. The Logos moves through the shipwreck as readily as through the calm sea. The Sympathia holds the stone and the star, and the soul that looks at both of them binds them in a single invisible whole that no amount of apparent separation actually severs. The augur reading the flight of birds in the sacred space was not wrong to believe that natural events carried meaning. The question was always whether the meaning was being read correctly, not whether it was there to be read. And Fortune's wheel, turning blind and vast and without malice, is not the last word on the cosmos, but only the word that Fortune, by her nature, is capable of saying. There are other voices. The ground beneath what changes is quiet. It has always been quiet. It was quiet in the tent on the Danube, while Marcus Aurelius wrote by lamplight, and it was quiet in Plotinus's Rome, while he composed his vision of the one sending its light through all things, and it was quiet in Boethius's cell, while philosophy arrived and sat down and spoke. The questions these thinkers were asking were not solved in any of those places. They were held and lived with and returned to and found, after enough honest returning, to be not a source of distress, but a kind of company. The cosmos may be ordered at a depth we cannot see from where we stand. The events that cross and converge and seem to answer one another may be the surface of something that holds them all, without requiring us to understand how. Whether this is true is not a question any one mind will settle tonight, but the tradition of asking it is very old, and it has been kept by people who thought carefully, and it is still open, and that openness itself has a quality worth resting inside. The wheel turns as it has always turned. The Logos moves as it has always moved, and beneath the turning, beneath the motion, beneath everything Fortune can reach and take, the philosophical ground holds, not in spite of all the reversals, but beneath them, always beneath them, still. Laplace wrote the word demon on a page in Paris, not as an invocation, but as a hypothesis, a way of pressing the logic of determinism to its outer limit and seeing what lived there. The year was 1814, and Pierre-Simon Laplace was the most accomplished mathematical physicist in Europe, a man who had spent decades refining the tools by which the movements of planets and the trajectories of cannon fire could be predicted with a precision that still astonished those who watched him work. He was not a man given to fantasy. The demon he imagined was not a creature, but a capacity, a hypothetical intellect, vast enough to hold in a single moment the position and momentum of every particle in the universe, from the smallest grain of matter to the outermost star, and from that complete knowledge to compute, without remainder, every event that had ever occurred, and every event that ever would, past and future, to such an intellect, would dissolve into one another. There would be no surprise, because surprise requires ignorance, and this mind would have none. There would be no coincidence, because coincidence requires two chains of events that no one has yet traced back to their common source, and this mind would have traced everything. In the fully deterministic universe Laplace was describing, The word chance would name nothing real. It would be a flag planted wherever human knowledge happened to run out, marking not a genuine gap in the causal order, but only a gap in human arithmetic. This thought experiment is worth sitting with in the dark of a night, not in order to accept it, but in order to feel the full weight of what it proposes. What Laplace was offering was a universe of perfect and total necessity, a universe in which every event, including every human choice and every moment of what feels like surprise, was already encoded in the initial conditions of all things, waiting only for the clock of causation to run forward and deliver it. A universe in which the tapping of a beetle at a window, the meeting of two strangers in a market, the thought that arrives unbidden in the middle of the night, all of these would be, in principle, as calculable as the orbit of Jupiter. Not mysterious at all, just complicated. The demon pressed the logic of Newtonian physics to a conclusion Newton himself had not drawn so starkly. And what is remarkable is not that Laplace proposed it, but that for a long time the proposal felt defensible, felt to careful and serious minds like a description of the kind of universe physics was converging on. The science of the 17th and 18th centuries had accumulated too many successes for this confidence to seem naive. Planets moved where the mathematics said they would move. Tides rose and fell on schedule. The solar system held its shape. If the universe was a mechanism, it was a mechanism of extraordinary reliability. And the most natural hypothesis about a reliable mechanism is that it contains no genuine randomness, no real gap, no place where something could happen that was not already determined to happen. And yet, even inside this framework, something did not quite settle. Jacob Bernoulli had noticed it a century before Laplace set down his demon. Bernoulli was a Swiss mathematician working in the late 17th century, a careful, methodical man, part of a family that produced more distinguished mathematicians than almost any other in the history of the discipline. He was interested in the behavior of chance, not as a philosopher, but as a technician of probability, working out the formal rules that govern games of dice and the calculation of risk. What he found, over many years of patient calculation, was the result that would later be called the law of large numbers. The demonstration that as a random process is repeated across an increasing number of trials, the observed results converge, steadily and without drama, toward the theoretical probability. Toss a fair coin 10 times, and the result may deviate wildly from the expected 50-50 split. Toss it 10,000 times, and the ratio will have crept close enough to equal that the deviation barely registers. Toss it 1,000,000 times, and the convergence is almost exact. What Bernoulli had found was not precisely what it appeared to be. On the surface, it looked like order emerging from chaos, like randomness, given enough room, disciplining itself into regularity. But what it actually demonstrated was subtler and in some ways more unsettling. It did not mean that any individual coin toss was predictable or that chance had been expelled from the small scale. It meant that the unpredictable micro-events were in aggregate constrained by a law they did not individually obey. Each toss was free, in the sense that the coin had no memory and no preference. The sequence as a whole was shaped, in the sense that its long-run ratios were fixed. These two facts, individual freedom and collective order, sat side by side without fully resolving, like a question that had been answered in the mathematical language but left hanging in the philosophical one. The law of large numbers carried a consequence that would have surprised Bernoulli himself. If striking coincidences are possible events, events with low but tungo probability, then in a world containing enough people having enough experiences across enough days, Such coincidences are not only unsurprising, but statistically inevitable. They must occur. The rarity of any specific coincidence is real. The chance that a particular pair of people, meeting in a particular city on a particular afternoon, share the same unusual birthday is genuinely small. But the chance that somewhere in a world of 8 billion people, some pair of strangers will today experience a coincidence that feels to them impossibly specific, impossibly apt, that chance is very close to certainty. There is a resultant probability that illustrates this gap between intuition and arithmetic with unusual clarity. In a room containing 23 people chosen at random, the probability that at least two of them share a birthday exceeds 50%. Not barely exceeds it, comfortably exceeds it. Most people, on hearing this for the first time, do not believe it. The number 23 feels too small. The space of possible birthdays, 365 of them, feels too large. The intuition insists that shared birthdays in small groups must be rare events, the kind of thing that happens once in many gatherings, the kind of coincidence that warrants a small exclamation when it occurs. The intuition is wrong, the mathematics is not. What makes the result feel so counterintuitive is that the mind, calculating the probability informally, tends to fix on a specific person in the room and ask how likely it is that someone shares that person's birthday. This is not the right calculation. The right calculation asks how likely it is that any person in the room shares a birthday with any other person in the room, which means considering all the possible pairs simultaneously, not one pair at a time. The number of possible pairs in a group of 23 people is 253. Each pair has roughly a 1 in 365 chance of a match. The chance that none of the 253 pairs match falls just below 50%. The chance that at least one pair matches rises just above it. The arithmetic is unambiguous. The astonishment, when it arrives, reveals something about the machinery of human perception rather than anything about the rarity of birthdays. And this is where the philosophy begins to complicate the mathematics, gently and without haste. The gap between what the intuition feels and what the calculation shows is not simply an error to be corrected. It is a window into something real about the kind of minds that experience coincidences and feel their weight, a mind that perceived all possible pairs simultaneously, that held the full combinatorial space before it at once, would feel no surprise at the shared birthday. It would have been expecting it, but the minds living inside the room, moving through a single day in a single body with a single limited field of attention, do not experience all possible pairs simultaneously. They experience the moment of discovery, the conversation that turns to birthdays, the realization that arrives, the sound of two people saying the same date. And at that moment, what the mind reaches for is not a calculation of pair frequency, but a feeling of smallness and specificity, the sense that of all the days in the year and all the people who might have been in this room, these two have arrived at the same one. The feeling is genuine, even where the statistics are routine. David Hume had pressed on a different part of this question from a different angle in an Edinburgh study more than a century before the birthday problem had been formally worked out. Hume was not primarily interested in coincidence, but in something more fundamental, the nature of causation itself, which is the thing that coincidence is usually contrasted with. He had been working through the structure of human knowledge, asking with persistent care what the mind actually encounters when it claims to know that one thing causes another. The answer he arrived at was one of the quieter philosophical earthquakes of the 18th century. not because it was noisy or dramatic, but because it had been sitting unnoticed in the logic of causation all along, and no one before him had looked quite directly at it. What Hume found, or rather what he failed to find, was causal necessity, the supposed connection between cause and effect that makes the effect follow the cause, not merely in fact, but of necessity, not merely usually, but always, not merely in this instance, but in every instance of this type. He could find the first event, he could find the second event, he could find in his own mind the expectation that the second would follow, an expectation that grew stronger the more often he had observed the sequence. What he could not find anywhere in experience was the connection itself, the necessary link, the force that made the second event obligatory rather than merely subsequent. A billiard ball rolls across a green table. It strikes a second ball. The second ball moves. Every observer in the room knows, before the impact, that the second ball will move. But Hume sat with this scene and noticed that what was known was a habit of expectation built from past observations, projected onto the present collision. The connection between the moving first ball and the obligatory movement of the second was not visible, it was not audible, it was not present in the event in the way that the colors of the balls were present, or the sound of the impact. It was added by the mind, inferred, projected, assumed, on the basis of nothing more metaphysically substantial than the fact that the sequence had occurred before and was expected to occur again. This was not a simple skeptical trick. Hume was not arguing that causation is an illusion in the sense that fire does not burn or that the sun will not rise. He was arguing that the philosophical concept of causal necessity, the idea that causes compel their effects in some deep metaphysical sense that goes beyond observed regularity, is a construction of the observing mind rather than a discovered property of the world. What we call causation is constant conjunction plus psychological habit. The necessity we feel is real. The necessity we feel it to be pointing at may not be. The implications unspool slowly if one sits with them long enough. If causal necessity is not discovered but constructed, if the mind projects it onto the sequences it repeatedly observes, then the absolute metaphysical distinction between causally connected events and merely coincident events becomes harder to maintain. What is a coincidence, after all, but two events observed together for which the usual projection of necessity has not yet been made? What distinguishes a cause from a coincidence, on Hume's account, is not some deep metaphysical feature of the events themselves, but the frequency with which they have been observed together and the strength of the habit that frequency has produced. A coincidence that occurred often enough, in enough contexts, with enough regularity, would eventually be reclassified as a cause, not because something had changed in the events, but because something had changed in the expectation. This does not dissolve the distinction between causal connection and mere coincidence, but it makes the distinction contingent in a way that classical physics had not been prepared to admit, contingent on observation, on habit, on the construction of the observing mind. The architecture of causation turns out to rest on psychological foundations more than metaphysical ones. And once that foundation is seen clearly, the question of whether certain coincidences might carry a different kind of connection, not mechanical, not necessary in the classical sense, but organized in some other way, cannot be shut down on purely logical grounds. It remains open. Quietly, without drama, it remains open. Laplace's demon had assumed that the universe Hume was examining, the universe of events and their sequences, was a fully deterministic mechanism whose causal structure was simply too large for any finite mind to trace completely. On this view, Hume's finding was not a discovery about causation, but a discovery about cognitive limitation. Causation was still out there, running the universe. The mind just couldn't see all of it. Chance was still epistemic, a name for the edge of human knowledge, rather than ontological, a name for something genuinely uncaused. This is a coherent response to Hume, and it was, for a long time, the default response of scientific rationalism. It sits comfortably enough with the law of large numbers. If everything is determined, then the convergence of observed frequencies on theoretical probabilities simply reflects the underlying structure, working itself out through the only mechanism it has available. Order was always there. The law just lets us see its profile. But Laplace's confidence in determinism rested on the mechanics of Newton, and what those mechanics assumed was that all physical quantities, position, momentum, energy, were in principle precisely defined at every moment, even if they could not always be precisely measured. This was the assumption that the following century's physics would find increasingly difficult to sustain. Friedrich Gauss had already noticed, in his work on the theory of errors in measurement, that the results of carefully repeated measurements tended to scatter around a central value in a distribution whose shape he could describe mathematically, but not fully explain. The scatter was not noise to be eliminated. It was a feature that obeyed its own laws. Gauss treated this as a practical matter, a property of measurement that could be characterized and corrected for, without pressing into the philosophical territory it might have opened. The bell curve of errors was a useful tool. What it implied about the nature of measurement itself, he left to others. It was left to later workers to press there. And what they found, slowly and across many disciplines, was that probability was not only a useful calculation tool for situations where human knowledge fell short. It was increasingly looking like something more fundamental, a genuine feature of the physical description of nature, not merely a surrogate for causal laws not yet discovered. The equipartition theorem in statistical mechanics, developed in the last decades of the 19th century by Boltzmann and Maxwell, described the behavior of gases not by tracking individual particles, an impossibility given their number, but by assigning probabilities to configurations and calculating the most likely overall behavior. Boltzmann in particular was explicit that this statistical description was not a shortcut around a deterministic truth, but the most complete description physics could honestly give. The individual molecular trajectory was unknowable in practice, and he began to suspect, in principle, the probability was not ignorance wearing a mathematical dress. It was the closest thing to knowledge that the situation permitted. Boltzmann paid a high price for this insistence. The scientific establishment of his era was not ready to accept irreducible statistical behavior as a fundamental feature of nature. He defended his position across decades against sustained opposition and died in 1906 before the resolution of the controversy he had started. Before, that is, the experimental confirmation of the atomic theory whose probabilistic behavior he had been describing. The atoms he had spent his career characterizing were not officially real to the consensus of physics until shortly after he was gone. The controversy Boltzmann had opened was not merely technical. Behind the equations was a philosophical question whose stakes were clear to everyone following the argument. Was probability a permanent feature of the best physical description of nature, or a temporary embarrassment awaiting replacement by a properly deterministic account? Was the world genuinely stochastic at some level, or was the stochasticity always an artifact of insufficient knowledge, a dressed-up version of ignorance? The question was still open when, in the first decades of the 20th century, A new physics arrived that would press it further than Boltzmann had pressed it, and in directions no one had anticipated. The framework of probability that had been used in statistical mechanics was not the framework that emerged from the quantum theory. Not exactly. In statistical mechanics, the probability attached to an outcome was, in principle, the right way to describe a situation of incomplete knowledge about an underlying reality that was itself perfectly definite. In quantum mechanics, the probability seemed, to those developing the formalism, to do something different. It did not attach to an underlying definite state, whose ignorance we were acknowledging. It attached to a superposition, a state in which the definite properties one was accustomed to asking about were simply not possessed by the system, not hidden, but genuinely absent until the act of measurement brought them into being. This was not Laplacian probability. This was something for which classical physics had no vocabulary, and for which the philosophy of the time had no prepared category. The question of how to interpret this probability, whether it reflected genuine ontological indeterminacy or merely encoded some deeper structure, not yet reached, would occupy the sharpest minds in physics for decades. It is a question that has not been fully resolved to this day. Different interpretations of quantum mechanics, Copenhagen, many worlds, pilot wave, relational, assign different statuses to the probability, give different accounts of what the wave function is and what its collapse means, and reach different conclusions about what the formalism implies for the nature of physical reality. What matters for the question at hand, the question of coincidence and its possible meaning, is not which interpretation is correct. What matters is the structure of the philosophical situation that the mathematics had produced. Classical physics had supported a picture of the universe in which probability was always epistemic, chance was always ignorance, and determinism was always the underlying truth beneath the visible uncertainty. Quantum mechanics had, in the eyes of many of its founders and most serious interpreters, rendered that picture untenable. Probability was not only epistemic, the universe was not at its foundations simply a larger version of Newton's celestial machine, running forward in perfectly deterministic steps. And if probability is not only epistemic, if it is, at least in some domain, a genuine feature of how things are, rather than a measure of how much we do not know, then Laplace's demon becomes impossible, not for practical reasons, but for reasons of principle. The demon cannot compute what has not yet been determined. The complete description of the universe at one moment does not fix the complete description of the universe at the next, at least not in every detail. There are genuine gaps, not large ones, on the scale of everyday life, but genuine ones. Frequentist probability, the interpretation that dominated the technical practice of statistics for most of the 20th century, defines probabilities as the limiting frequencies of outcomes in long-run repeated trials. A fair coin has a probability of 1/2, because in the limit of infinitely many tosses, it lands heads half the time. This definition has great practical virtue. It is testable. It is objective. It does not depend on any individual's degree of confidence, but it carries a philosophical cost. Under frequentist probability, strictly interpreted, one cannot assign a probability to a single unrepeatable event. And what is the probability that two particular people with a particular history of inner life and outer experience will have a particular convergent experience on a particular afternoon? The frequentist framework has no clean answer. The event cannot be placed in a reference class of similar events in a non-arbitrary way. It cannot be repeated. The limiting frequency is undefined. This is not a merely technical point. matters for the philosophical assessment of coincidence, precisely because coincidences, as lived experiences, are unrepeatable. The encounter happens once. The convergence between the inner event and the outer one is specific, contextual, embedded in a particular life at a particular moment. The frequentist framework, taken seriously, cannot even begin to assess it. It says only that, given sufficient population and sufficient time, low probability events will occur, and that the feeling of significance attached to one's own such event is mathematically uninformative. Bayesian probability offers a different architecture. Rather than defining probability as a limiting frequency, Bayesianism treats it as a rational degree of belief, the degree of confidence a well-calibrated reasoner should assign to a proposition given available evidence. This belief can be revised as new evidence arrives, following a precise mathematical rule, and the entire framework is designed around single-case reasoning rather than long-run frequencies. A Bayesian statistician can assign a probability to a one-off event, hold that probability provisionally, update it when new information becomes available, and maintain throughout a posture of honest uncertainty rather than false precision. The philosophical temperament of Bayesianism has a particular quality. It is not the temperament of the expert who delivers a verdict from a settled position, but of the careful reasoner who knows that all conclusions are held on the best available evidence, and that better evidence changes the conclusion. There is no shame in updating. There is no pride to be lost in revising. What the framework rewards is not certainty but calibration, the ability to hold beliefs in proportion to the evidence that supports them, neither more confidently nor less confidently than the evidence warrants. This is closer in spirit to how coincidences are actually assessed by the minds that experience them. A person who encounters a convergence between inner and outer, who thinks of a distant friend and then receives a letter, who dreams of a place and then finds a reason to go there, does not in practice run a frequentist calculation. They update. They hold a feeling of significance, note whether it persists under reflection, notice whether additional events seem to cluster around it or dissolve it, and arrive over time at a degree of belief, sometimes increasing, sometimes diminishing, about whether the convergence was meaningful or merely arithmetic. The Bayesian framework does not validate coincidences as meaningful. That would exceed its competence. What it does is provide a framework in which the question can be asked without the automatism of dismissal, without the blunt instrument of coincidences must occur. Therefore, this one is merely statistical. The Bayesian says, here is a single event, here is the evidence it provides, here is a prior probability, here is a revised probability. The question of whether the revision is warranted remains a philosophical one. The framework just keeps the conversation honest. Hume had noticed that causal necessity was a construction of the mind. The birthday problem illustrates that the sense of coincidence is shaped by systematic gaps between intuition and calculation. The law of large numbers shows that individually striking events are collectively inevitable. Laplace had imagined a demon that would render all of this trivial, a mind for which coincidence would have no purchase because it would have no ignorance. But the demon cannot exist, not because it is too large to build or too slow to compute, but because the universe it was designed to inhabit, the fully deterministic universe of perfectly defined positions and momenta and forces, is not the universe that the mathematics of the last century describes. There are places in physical reality where the full specification of initial conditions does not determine the future outcome, not because we cannot measure finely enough, but because there is no fact of the matter to measure. This does not mean that coincidences are therefore meaningful. The argument does not run so cleanly. It means only that the universe is not so closed as the demon assumed, that there is genuine indeterminacy at the foundations, that probability is not only ignorance, and that the description of the world as a mechanism whose every output was fixed before the first moment of time is not, in the end, the most defensible description available. What follows from this is not a conclusion, but a landscape. A landscape in which the question of coincidence's meaning cannot be closed off by appeal to determinism, because determinism at the quantum scale is not available as an appeal. A landscape in which the intuitive sense that certain convergences carry a weight not captured by arithmetic is not automatically dissolved by the mathematics of large numbers, because the mathematics of large numbers says nothing about what any particular event means to the particular mind in which it is experienced. A landscape in which Hume's observation that causal necessity is a projection of the mind rather than a discovered feature of the world leaves the absolute distinction between the causal and the coincident standing on ground that is, philosophically speaking, softer than it looks. The frequentist and the Bayesian do not agree on what probability is. The Copenhagen physicist and the pilot wave physicist do not agree on what the quantum formalism means. Laplace's demon cannot be built. Bernoulli's law shows that coincidences must occur in sufficient quantities, but says nothing about which ones matter to which lives. Hume has made the causal bond more fragile than the physics textbooks suggest. None of this settles the question of whether any particular coincidence is meaningful. The question is not the kind that settles, it is the kind that one lives with for a long time, picking it up and putting it down, finding it changed each time by the experience that accumulated in the interval. The mathematician finds it differently weighted after the birthday problem than before. The person who has looked carefully at Hume finds it differently weighted after his analysis of the billiard table. The physicist who has sat with the implications of quantum indeterminacy finds it differently weighted than the physicist who has not. What persists through all of this, through the probability theory and the philosophy of causation and the limits of the demon, is the fact of the felt experience itself. The moment on the pavement when two things converge in a way that does not feel merely accidental, the recognition that arrives before the argument has time to organize itself, the sense, which may be unfounded and may not be, that certain meetings of inner and outer are not simply products of chance, or rather that the word simply is doing more work in that sentence than it can honestly carry. The convergence of statistical mechanics and quantum theory across the last century has changed what is permissible to say about the world's relation to chance. What it has not changed is the lived character of the experience. The person in the room where the birthdays coincide still catches a breath. Hume still sits in Edinburgh, finding the causal connection absent from experience. Bernoulli's coin still shows its face, indifferent to what the last toss revealed, free in its small fall toward the table. The mathematics was never the whole of it. The mathematics cannot be the whole of it, not because the mathematics is deficient, but because the question it is being asked to answer includes dimensions, the felt weight of a convergence, the meaning a mind makes in the middle of an unexpected meeting, that do not reduce to frequencies or priors or quantum amplitudes. These dimensions are not illusions. They are part of what is happening when coincidence registers as something other than chance. Whether they point beyond the mind that feels them, or whether they are entirely contained within it, is the question that the probability theory cannot decide, and the philosophy has not yet closed. Hume looked at the billiard table and did not find the necessity he expected to find. He found the events, and the habit of expectation, and a silence where the metaphysical bond was supposed to be. He did not conclude from this that the bond was absent. He concluded only that its presence had not been demonstrated, that it had been assumed, and that the assumption was not the same as the fact. The silence where causal necessity was supposed to be is not an empty silence. It is the silence in which other possibilities have not yet been ruled out, not by the mathematics, not by the philosophy, not in the end by anything that has been carefully enough done to close the question permanently. That silence is the space the question lives in, open, unhurried, and at rest in its own uncertainty, the way a long conversation eventually settles into comfortable quiet. Two people sitting together after the argument has been set down, neither of them sure, neither of them in a hurry to be. Heisenberg had the result already written when he sat down in the quiet. The mathematics had resolved. The paper was there on the desk before him, and what it said could not be unsaid. It said that nature does not hold certain values until the moment of measurement, that position and momentum are not hidden variables waiting to be found, but genuinely undetermined until the act of looking brings one of them into existence. He had not described a limitation of instruments. He had described a limitation inscribed into the structure of the world itself, deeper than any tool, prior to any observation, belonging to the nature of things rather than to the nature of human ignorance. The year was 1927. The physics that had governed scientific thought for 2.5 centuries, the physics of Newton and Laplace, in which every future state of the universe was in principle calculable from a complete knowledge of the present, had reached its boundary, not its end precisely. Classical mechanics remained as accurate as it had ever been at the scales it was designed to describe, but the boundary was real, and on the other side of it was something that classical thought had never anticipated, a universe that did not fully determine itself in advance, that held genuine openness at its smallest scales, that was not a machine running a program, but something else, something for which the available vocabulary was not quite ready. Heisenberg would later describe the feeling of arriving at this result as something close to vertigo, not the frightening kind, but the kind that arrives when the ground shifts, and one finds, after a moment, that there is still ground. The shift was real, the ground remained. What had changed was the shape of it, and what could be said about it, and what had to be left honestly, in silence. In the years just before this, in the comfortable dining rooms and hotel conference halls of Brussels, a disagreement had been forming between two men who admired each other with the particular warmth that genuine intellectual opponents sometimes manage. Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr had been meeting at the Solvay conferences, gatherings of the world's leading physicists, convened to address the foundational problems of the new quantum theory, and their disagreement had grown in proportion to the depth at which it was conducted. Einstein had looked at quantum mechanics and had found it beautiful but incomplete, and the indeterminacy Heisenberg had formalized, the irreducible uncertainty Bohr was building into the Copenhagen interpretation, the apparent absence of hidden variables that would restore determinism beneath the probabilistic surface. These things Einstein could not accept as the final word. God, he said, does not play dice. Bohr's reply, in various recorded forms, amounted to something like, "Who are we to tell God what to do?" The Copenhagen interpretation held that quantum indeterminacy is not a symptom of incomplete knowledge, but a fundamental feature of physical reality. The electron does not have a definite position that we have failed to measure. It has no definite position until a measurement is made. The wave function that describes its state is not a description of our ignorance. It is a description of what is actually there, a superposition of possibilities, none of them realized, until the interaction with a measuring apparatus collapses it into a single actual event. These two visions of the universe, Einstein's, in which a deeper order waits beneath the quantum surface, and Bohr's, in which the quantum surface is as deep as it goes, could not both be right, and the disagreement between them was not a technical dispute about equations. It was a dispute about what kind of universe this is, about whether determinism is a property of nature or a projection of the mind onto nature, about whether, when all the veils are lifted, there is a hidden clockwork beneath, or something genuinely and irreducibly open. What no one fully appreciated at the time was how strange the implications of quantum mechanics were going to become once they were extended beyond the behavior of single particles and applied to the correlations between particles that had once been in contact. This strangeness had its first public statement in 1935 in a paper published by Einstein together with Boris Podolsky and Nathan Rosen. The paper was designed as a proof that quantum mechanics must be incomplete, that behind its probabilistic surface there must exist what they called hidden variables, definite values, the theory did not reach. The argument turned on an apparent paradox, which would come to carry all three of their initials. Two particles interact and then separate. They travel in opposite directions, moving apart until any signal traveling between them at the speed of light, or slower, or at any speed, could not connect a measurement performed on one with a result obtained from the other in the available time. A measurement is performed on the first particle, its value is determined. At the same moment, the second particle, arbitrarily distant, is measured, and its value is found to be correlated with the first in a way that quantum mechanics predicts with complete accuracy. Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen argued that this correlation must reflect a pre-existing arrangement, that both particles must have carried definite values from the moment of their separation, values hidden in the formalism of quantum mechanics but real, the way a pair of gloves separated into two boxes is not mysterious when you open one and find it is a left glove, because the other was always a right. The difficulty was that quantum mechanics was not describing gloves, the correlations it predicted, and which experiments were finding, could not be explained by any pre-existing arrangement of hidden variables. John Bell saw this in 1964, and he formalized the impossibility as a theorem, a mathematical proof that no theory of hidden local variables could reproduce all the statistical predictions of quantum mechanics. The proof set a boundary. The correlations that quantum mechanics predicted exceeded what any locally realistic theory could generate. If quantum mechanics was right, then either locality was wrong, meaning that events could influence each other across distances no signal should be able to bridge, or realism was wrong in the particular sense that particles do not carry definite values before they are measured. One or the other had to go. Alan Aspect went into a laboratory in Paris in 1982 and asked the universe which one it was. The experiment used pairs of photons generated by calcium atoms, separated and sent to detectors positioned so that no signal moving at the speed of light could travel between them in the time available between the settings of the detectors being chosen and the measurements being recorded. The correlations were real. The numbers matched the quantum mechanical prediction. They violated Bell's inequality, the mathematical boundary that any locally realistic theory had to respect. Something connected the particles across the separation, not a signal, not a mechanism, not any force or field that classical physics could name. Something else, a connection that existed without any of the ordinary machinery of causation, a correlation that was not the trace of a shared past arrangement, but the expression of a shared quantum state, persisting across distance in a way that no classical picture could accommodate. The word that physicists settled on for this was entanglement. The word points at something for which ordinary spatial language is ill equipped, because the entangled particles are not in communication. They are in some sense that resists easy formulation. Still one thing. The quantum state they share is not divided between them at the moment of separation. It remains whole, non-local, distributed across the gap. When one is measured, the other responds, not after a delay, not through any medium, but instantaneously, as though the distance between them is less real than the connection. Einstein had named this spooky action at a distance, and he had meant it as a complaint. The experiments had taken his complaint and turned it into a confirmed description of how things are. Now it would be a mistake, and a convenient one, of the kind convenient mistakes usually are, to draw a straight line from quantum entanglement to synchronicity and claim that one explains the other. The non-local correlations of entangled quantum particles operate at scales far below the threshold of neural processes, and the leap from subatomic physics to the coincidence of a dreamed golden beetle and a rose chafer at a window is not one that any honest argument can simply take in stride. For the connection, if there is one, is not a mechanism. It is something more like an opening, a place where the argument for a purely mechanistic universe runs into a difficulty it cannot fully resolve, and where different kinds of question become at least philosophically permissible. What quantum mechanics had genuinely demonstrated by the middle of the 20th century was that the picture of the universe built by classical physics, the picture in which every event is the determinate effect of prior causes, in which probability is only a measure of human ignorance, in which nothing connects across space without a signal to carry it, was not a complete description of what is actually there. The universe, at the scale of its fundamental constituents, was more open, more connected, and in certain respects more strange than the clockwork model had implied. What was to be made of that openness was not yet clear, but the openness itself was established, and it changed the shape of what could reasonably be said. It was in this atmosphere, not yet fully settled philosophically, not yet absorbed into ordinary educated understanding, that a physicist named Wolfgang Pauli had been writing letters to a psychoanalyst in Zurich. Pauli was one of the great theoretical physicists of the century. The exclusion principle that bore his name had reshaped the understanding of atomic structure. His contributions to quantum field theory had been fundamental. He was a scientist of rigorous technical intelligence, and he was not a man inclined toward mysticism. What he was inclined toward was honesty, and honesty required him to acknowledge that his inner life, his dreams in particular, contained something he could not take to his colleagues. The letters to Jung began in the 1930s and continued until the late 1950s. They have since been gathered and published under the title Atom and Archetype, and reading them is a particular kind of experience, because what one encounters is a first-rate scientific mind working at the edges of what it can honestly say. Pauli described dreams of extraordinary symbolic density, a world clock, a rotating figure, mathematical patterns that felt as though they belonged simultaneously to the structure of physics and to the structure of something else, something interior, something that did not have a clean scientific name. He was not asking Jung to interpret these dreams in order to cure him of something. He was asking because he was genuinely uncertain what domain they belonged to, and he suspected that the division between inner and outer reality, the division between what happens in the psyche and what happens in the physical world, was more philosophically problematic than the scientific orthodoxy of his time was prepared to admit. Pauli's worry was precise. Physics operated on the assumption that the observer could, in principle, be separated from the observed. The experiment described an external reality, and the scientist's mental states were not part of the description. But quantum mechanics had already made this separation complicated. The role of measurement in determining quantum outcomes had produced a debate about the boundary between the measuring apparatus and the system measured, and some serious thinkers had gone so far as to implicate consciousness itself in the collapse of the wave function, though most physicists set this aside as philosophy rather than physics. Pauli was not setting it aside. He was sitting with it, in the particular way someone sits with a problem that resists easy dismissal. What Pauli proposed to Jung, and what Jung took seriously enough to include in the joint publication they eventually produced together. He was the idea of a neutral language, a symbolic vocabulary that would not belong exclusively to physics or to psychology, that could describe events occurring at the intersection of inner psychic reality and outer physical reality without forcing that intersection into either framework alone. The idea was speculative. Pauli knew it was speculative, but the alternative, insisting that inner and outer were cleanly separable when quantum mechanics had already shown that the act of observation could not be cleanly separated from the thing observed, struck him as a more dishonest position than the one he was cautiously defending. The letters Pauli wrote carry a particular quality of intellectual courage. He was a man at the height of his scientific reputation, writing to a psychoanalyst about dreams, proposing ideas that his physicist colleagues would not have found credible, and doing so not because he had lost his scientific judgment, but because his scientific judgment had brought him to a place where the standard categories were no longer quite sufficient. The boundary between the respectable and the merely speculative is drawn, in any period, partly by convention and partly by argument, and Pauli had followed the arguments far enough to find himself standing at a boundary he did not think was where convention placed it. There is something in Pauli's situation that has an analogy in the work of David Bohm, though the two men came to their positions from different angles and with different emphases. Bohm had been a student of Robert Oppenheimer and had later worked with Einstein, and his engagement with quantum mechanics had led him to construct what became known as the pilot wave interpretation, a deterministic account in which quantum particles do have definite positions and trajectories, guided by a wave field that carries information about the entire configuration of the universe. This interpretation was technically equivalent to standard quantum mechanics in its predictions, but philosophically different in its ontology. It restored something like hidden variables, satisfied Einstein's intuition that the quantum description must be incomplete, and proposed a kind of non-local connection. The wave that guided each particle was sensitive to the entire experimental arrangement, not just the local conditions. But Bohm did not stop at the pilot wave. In his later work, particularly in Wholeness and the Implicate Order, published in 1980, he developed a cosmological framework of a different kind. The universe, Bohm proposed, had two nested dimensions. There was the explicate order, the surface of separate, distinguishable, causally sequential events that constitute ordinary experience, the world of objects with definite positions moving through a clock-measured time. And beneath this, or rather within it, or perhaps better said, as its source and ground, there was the implicate order, a domain in which everything is enfolded into everything else, in which the apparent separateness of the explicate surface is a local and provisional unfolding from a deeper wholeness that has never been divided. The image Bohm returned to more than once was that of a hologram. In an ordinary photograph, Each region of the film contains information about only the part of the scene it recorded. Destroy one region of the photograph, and that part of the scene is gone. A hologram works differently. The information about the entire scene is distributed across the entire surface of the holographic film, so that any region of the film, however small, contains enough information to reconstruct the whole image, though with reduced resolution. The hologram is a physical object in which the local and the global are related in a way that ordinary objects are not, in which each part, in a sense, contains the whole. Bohm was not claiming that the universe is literally a hologram. He was using the hologram as a way of gesturing toward the kind of relationship he believed existed between the implicate and the explicate orders, a relationship in which local events, the particular things that happen in particular places at particular times, are the unfolding of a wholeness that has never actually been fragmented. The separateness of the explicate order, the chairs and tables, the photons in Aspect's laboratory, the dreamer and the beetle and the window, is real as experience, but it is not, in Bohm's vision, the deepest description. The deepest description is the undivided whole, from which these separate forms momentarily emerge, and into which they return. What this means for the kind of connection that synchronicity points at is not obvious, and Bohm was careful not to overreach. He was not claiming that meaningful coincidences are caused by the implicate order in the way that a billiard ball is caused to move by the impact of another. Causation in the ordinary sense belongs to the explicate order, to the surface of sequential events. The implicate order does not produce events by pushing on other events. If it relates events, it does so by a different kind of principle, not a chain of force, but a shared enfolding, a participation in the same underlying wholeness that expresses itself at the surface as correlation without mechanism. This is close to what Jung meant by acausal orderedness, and it is worth sitting for a moment with the fact that two serious thinkers working in different disciplines, one a psychiatrist and one a physicist, arrived at something like the same difficulty and something like the same tentative response. Neither of them was claiming to have explained synchronicity. Neither of them thought the explanation was simple. What they both found themselves pointing at was the possibility that the universe contains a mode of order different from the causal mechanical mode that classical science described, an order organized not by force and sequence, but by something more like meaning or wholeness or coherence, something for which the ordinary scientific vocabulary was not well designed. The uncertainty principle sits quietly inside all of this. What Heisenberg showed was not just that certain measurements are limited in their precision. What he showed more deeply was that the question, what is the precise state of this system before I observe it, may not have a determinate answer, that the universe at its fundamental level does not hold all its values at once, does not carry within it a complete specification of every future event. The Laplacian demon, the hypothetical intellect that could compute all of history from a perfect knowledge of the present, cannot exist, not because no mind is large enough, but because the present does not contain the information it would need. The present is genuinely open. The future is not inscribed in the past. What happens next is not fully settled by what has happened before. This is a modest-sounding claim, and in some ways it is modest. Quantum indeterminacy is largely irrelevant at the scales of daily experience. Chairs do not quantum fluctuate. Conversations do not take place in superpositions of possible sentences. The macroscopic world appears, for almost all practical purposes, to obey something very close to the deterministic mechanics that Newton described. But at the foundations, the openness is real, And a universe that is genuinely open at its foundations is a philosophically different kind of universe from one that is not, even if the difference is small at the scales of ordinary life. It changes, for instance, what can be said about causation. In a fully deterministic universe, every event is the necessary consequence of prior events, and the only question is whether we have identified all the causes. In a universe with genuine quantum indeterminacy, some events are not the necessary consequence of prior events. They occur within a range of possibilities defined by the quantum state, but which particular possibility is realized is not determined in advance. The causal chain in such a universe runs right up to the point of quantum indeterminacy, and there it stops. What happens next is real, and it is new, and it was not contained in everything that preceded it. Into this gap, not to fill it, not to claim to have explained what is happening in it, but to observe that it is there. Jung placed his acausal principle. The argument was not that synchronistic events are caused by quantum fluctuations. It was that the universe is not exhaustively described by causal mechanical principles, and that synchronistic experience points at whatever else is there. The whatever else is not nothing. It is, at minimum, the genuine openness that quantum mechanics established. Beyond that minimum, the argument becomes more speculative, and Jung knew it, and Pauli knew it, and Bohm knew it, and the knowing did not stop any of them from continuing to look. There is a particular quality that attaches to serious thinking at the edge of what can be said. It is not the quality of mysticism, of simply asserting connections without examining them, of finding meaning everywhere and therefore nowhere. It is the quality of careful, honest intellectual effort that has followed its own methods as far as they will go, and found, at the edge that the methods do not quite reach. What lies beyond the reach is not proven to exist by the failure, but the failure itself, the genuine, examined, intellectually honest failure of the available frameworks to close the question, is not nothing. It is, in fact, precisely what makes the question worth continuing to hold. Aspects measurements in 1982 showed that entangled particles correlate in ways that no locally realistic theory can account for. Bohm's implicate order proposed that the separateness of the explicate surface is not the deepest description. Pauli wrote to Jung because his experience could not be fully contained by either physics or psychology, and the most honest thing he knew how to do was to hold the difficulty rather than resolve it prematurely. Heisenberg sat with his result in the quiet after the mathematics had finished, knowing that something had been established that would take decades to fully absorb. But are not steps in a single argument converging on a single conclusion. The history of 20th century physics did not produce a scientific proof of synchronicity, and no honest account of it can claim otherwise. What it produced was a dismantling of the particular model of the universe, the closed, deterministic, locally causal, mechanically complete model that had seemed, in the centuries after Newton, to leave no room for any other kind of order. The room, it turned out, was there. What should inhabit it has not been decided. The question of what inhabits it is the question that remains. Not urgently, not as a problem demanding immediate resolution, but as the kind of question that a serious mind can hold without distress, the kind of question that opens rather than closes the world, that makes the ordinary darkness of a room at night feel not smaller, but in some way that is difficult to name precisely, more continuous with everything else that is also here, also held, also part of whatever whole the implicate order enfolds in its silent and impenetrable depth. Bohm imagined the entire universe as something like an unbroken wave, its surface full of temporary forms that rise and settle, each one carrying within it, enfolded, implicit, real, the information of the whole from which it momentarily emerged. Every particle connected to every other not by a chain of forces across the space between them, but by their shared origin in a wholeness that was never at any level actually divided. The separateness that daily experience presents is in this vision a local and provisional feature of the explicate surface, real enough at that surface, real enough to build tables with and measure distances across, but not the final word on what the universe is made of, or how it holds itself together, or what kinds of order are available to it beneath the mechanical one that the eye can follow. If that is what the universe is, then a meaningful convergence between an inner event and an outer one, a dream and a window, and a small iridescent creature pressing against the glass in the autumn light, would not require a mechanism to be real. It would require only that the inner and the outer, the psychic and the physical, are not as separate as the surface of things suggests. It would require only that the wholeness from which both emerge is capable of expressing itself in patterns that a human mind, attending carefully, can sometimes recognize as coherent. Whether it requires that, whether synchronicity is evidence of such wholeness, or simply a feature of minds disposed to find pattern and meaning even where the universe is merely random, is a question the physics does not answer. It only holds the space in which the question can be asked without having been settled in advance. And that space, which the classical universe did not have, is where the thinking now rests, quiet and genuinely open, the way still water is open to whatever falls into it from above, neither refusing nor insisting, simply holding the surface ready, and beneath the surface, depth that continues further than any single night of thought can follow. A woman is standing on a pavement in an ordinary city, in the middle of an ordinary morning, and she has just stopped walking. Around her, the street continues, the low hum of traffic, a bicycle passing, the sound of a door somewhere being pulled shut, and she stands in the middle of all of it, completely still, because a stranger has just spoken aloud the sentence she was holding in silence inside her own mind. Not a common sentence, not a greeting or a weather remark or any of the dozen things strangers say in passing. This was the sentence she had been carrying since she woke, the one that belonged to something unresolved in her, and it arrived in a stranger's voice from a conversation she had no part in, and now she is standing still on the pavement, and the world is continuing around her. She does not yet know what to do with this. That is the important thing. She has not decided whether to laugh, or to be still, or to write it down, or to tell someone. She has not reached for the word coincidence, and she has not reached for the word meaning. She is in the space between the event and its interpretation, and in that space there is something that feels less like confusion than like an opening, a small unexpected door in the wall of the morning, standing ajar. This is where the oldest questions about chance and meaning actually live. Not in the theories about them, not in the arguments for and against, but in this moment on the pavement, before the mind has moved to close what opened. The human tendency to find patterns is old, and it runs deep. Scientists who study the architecture of perception have a word for it, apophenia, which names the universal capacity to see meaningful connections in information that may not carry them, to find faces in clouds and intentions in coincidence and order in the arrangement of leaves after the wind has passed. The word was set down by a psychiatrist named Klaus Conrad in 1958, though the tendency it names is far older than any word for it. Conrad was interested in the heightened pattern perception that accompanies certain altered states of mind. But what he had found and named turned out to be not a symptom of anything in particular, so much as a description of the ordinary human mind operating in its default mode, doing what it has always done, finding more than may be there to find. The evolutionary argument for this tendency is straightforward. An organism living in an uncertain environment, where some patterns conceal predators and others conceal food, does better to over-detect than to under-detect. The creature that reads threat into every rustling is more likely to survive than the one that waits for confirmation. The cost of the false positive, the alarm that turns out to be only wind, is a moment of wasted fear. The cost of the false negative, the calm that turns out to be a failure to notice something real, may be everything. And so the mind that persisted, the mind that was passed forward through the long generations of before history, was a mind primed toward significance, a mind that would rather find 10 false meanings than miss one real one. This is an honest piece of the picture. The philosophical question of synchronicity must hold it without flinching. To say that the mind is built to find patterns is not to say that no patterns are real. It is only to say that the instrument of perception has its own nature, its own tilt, its own history, and that this must be accounted for before conclusions are drawn in either direction. Jung knew something like this, though he approached it from a different angle. In his consulting room in Kusnacht, working with patients over the long years of his practice, he had noticed something that resisted simple explanation. There were patients who had been psychologically fixed for months, defended, rigid, armored against the movement that might change them, and sometimes what finally moved them was not a word spoken in the room, but something that arrived from outside the room entirely. A bird, a shift in the light, a sound from the street that seemed to rhyme with something in the dream they were describing, as though the outer world, for a moment, had become a participant in the inner one, as though the boundary between the psychic and the physical, ordinarily so solid, had become briefly permeable. Jung described this in terms of the deep structures of the psyche he called archetypes, patterns so fundamental to human experience that they appeared not only across cultures and centuries, but in the imagery of individual dreams, in the symbols thrown up by crisis, in the felt quality of certain moments that seemed to belong to something larger than the personal history of the person living them. The self, the shadow, the figures that move through the oldest stories. Jung proposed that synchronistic events tended to cluster around moments when these deeper patterns were active, when the psyche was in motion at its deepest level, when something fundamental was shifting, and that in those moments the outer world sometimes offered a symbol that corresponded to the inner drama in a way that no causal account could reach. This was not a modest proposal. Jung knew it. He spent years circling it, testing it against his clinical experience, corresponding about it with physicists and sinologists, and anyone who seemed to be asking a related question from a different direction. The proposition he eventually set down was precise in its caution. Not that all coincidences carry meaning, not that the world is governed by a benevolent intelligence, arranging events for each person's benefit, but that there exists a class of events in which inner and outer converge in a way that is symbolically coherent, yet causally inexplicable, and that these events deserve a category of their own rather than forced assimilation into either pure chance or divine intention. Viktor Frankl arrived at his own angle on this question from a direction as far from Jung's consulting room as it is possible to imagine. Frankl was a psychiatrist in Vienna who survived the concentration camps of Auschwitz and Dachau and returned to his work with the bones of a philosophy he had begun developing before the war, now tested against something that none of his theoretical frameworks had been built to face. What he found in the camps and in the years of reflection that followed was that the will to meaning was not a secondary feature of the human animal, not a luxury that fell away under genuine extremity, but something closer to a biological and existential necessity. The prisoners who endured, not always but more often than chance would predict, were those who could locate even a small private meaning in their situation, the memory of a face, a task that awaited them, a piece of music not yet written, a person who would need them if they survived. The meaning did not need to be large, it needed only to be real. Frankl called this logotherapy, healing through meaning, and built from his observations a philosophical position that placed the search for meaning at the center of human psychology, not as an intellectual preference, but as a constitutive drive. The capacity to find significance in apparently arbitrary events was not, in this view, a cognitive peculiarity or a comforting self-deception. It was a fundamental feature of human flourishing, as essential in its way as food or warmth, and its absence was as damaging as any physical deprivation. These two threads, the cognitive science that traces pattern finding to evolutionary pressure, and the clinical and philosophical tradition that finds in meaning seeking a genuine human necessity, do not resolve neatly into one another. They sit side by side, each honest, each partial, each pointing at something the other leaves in shadow. The mind is built to over-detect. The mind requires meaning to live. Both of these are true, and the fact that both are true does not simplify the question of what any particular experience of meaningful coincidence actually is. The woman on the pavement is still there. In a sense, the moment has not resolved. She has not yet decided what she holds in her hands, and the decision she eventually reaches will depend on who she is, what she has already lived, what tradition of thinking she has access to, and what her own tolerance for open questions turns out to be. Some people will close the moment quickly, file it under coincidence, and continue walking. Some will hold it open for days, returning to it at odd moments, sensing that it belongs to something they cannot yet name. Both responses are available. Neither is obviously wrong. Confirmation bias enters this territory. Honestly, it is one of the most extensively documented tendencies in human psychology, the inclination to search for, notice, and remember information that confirms what one already believes, while failing to register or weight the information that does not. In the context of meaningful coincidence, this means that a person who is already inclined toward synchronicity will disproportionately notice the events that seem to confirm it, and will fail to register the enormous background of occasions on which nothing meaningful converged, in which the inner life was active and the outer world offered nothing in response, in which the thought went unechoed and the moment passed without a correspondent. The statistical fabric of non-occurrence is invisible to the experience of the person living through it. Only the convergences stand out. Demonstrating this bias does not by itself prove that no convergences carry genuine meaning. That is the important qualification, and it is one that the cognitive tradition sometimes glosses over in its haste toward the clean conclusion. What confirmation bias shows is that the instrument of subjective experience cannot be trusted to provide an unbiased sample of the events it lives through. It does not show that the biased sample contains nothing real. The argument from cognitive limitation tells us to hold our conclusions provisionally, to weight our experience with care, to resist the pull toward certainty. It does not tell us what the corrected conclusion, once all the adjustments are made, would actually be. There is something in the philosophical tradition that knows how to sit in exactly this place, the place between the argument that deflates and the experience that persists. Aristotle named it at the opening of his Metaphysics, in a sentence that has been returned to across the centuries. not because it resolves anything, but because it names something so accurately. He wrote that philosophy begins in wonder. The Greek word is thaumazion, the particular state of mind in which a question is genuinely open, and the person holding it is genuinely present to it, not yet reaching for a resolution, not yet deflecting into skepticism or affirmation, but sitting with the question itself in a kind of alert and patient stillness. Wonder, as Aristotle understood it, is not the same as ignorance. It is not simply the absence of knowledge. It is a specific relationship to a question, a posture toward the unknown that is active rather than passive, engaged rather than merely confused. The philosopher in wonder has seen enough of the question to know what it would take to answer it, and has found that the answer is not yet available, and has chosen to remain present to the question rather than collapse it prematurely in either direction. This is a discipline. It requires something of the person who attempts it. It requires the tolerance for an open ending that most of our ordinary habits of mind are specifically designed to foreclose. Socrates made his own version of this claim in the declaration that the only wisdom he could confidently own was the knowledge of his ignorance, not ignorance as defeat, not the helpless shrug of someone who has given up, but the active, disciplined acknowledgement that the questions he was asking were genuinely hard, that the traditions of confident answer he had examined had each under pressure turned out to be less certain than they appeared, and that to live in this honest uncertainty was not a failure of philosophy, but its most authentic expression. The examined life for Socrates was not one that had arrived at final answers. It was one that had stopped pretending the questions were simpler than they were. Montaigne, coming to this tradition more than 1,000 years later, from his tower in the Perigord, found in the suspension of judgment something close to a practical philosophy of the self. He called his version of it, at various moments, by various names, but what he was describing was the practice of holding his own experience, including his strangest experiences, the ones that resisted the available categories, with a kind of gentle, unhurried curiosity that did not rush to either affirmation or dismissal. Montaigne was a man who took his own particularities seriously. He noticed what he noticed. He wrote down the strange correspondences he had observed in his own life, not because he had a theory about what they meant, but because they seemed to him to belong to the honest account of what it was to be alive. This tradition, Socrates, Montaigne, the long line of thinkers who have found in honest uncertainty a form of peace rather than a source of distress, offers a way of inhabiting the question of synchronicity that neither the strong believer nor the firm skeptic has easy access to. It is a way that requires neither the surrender of critical intelligence nor the performance of explanatory closure. It holds both the cognitive critique and the lived experience with equal care, and finds in the holding itself a kind of philosophical rest. In the long history of this question, across all the traditions and all the centuries that have turned it over, what keeps returning is not an answer, but a quality of attention. The Stoics brought it to the Logos. They found running through all things, not as a belief they had proved, but as a practice of looking that changed what they were able to see. The Neoplatonists brought it to the Sympatheia. They felt threading through the great chain of being, the invisible correspondence between things separated in space and time, that they traced not with instruments, but with the particular attentiveness of a mind trained to look for unity beneath multiplicity. The ancient augurs brought it to the birds, the direction of flight, the mood of the morning, the small, unpredictable events of nature that they had been taught to read as a language addressed to those who knew how to listen. None of these traditions was doing the same thing, and none of them arrived at the same conclusion. What they shared was the refusal to regard the apparent randomness of events as the final word on the question of order. Each of them, in its own way, was asking whether the surface of things concealed a deeper arrangement, not hidden by deception, not occluded by some power that chose to keep it from ordinary sight, but simply requiring a different kind of looking than the one that ordinary practical life demands. Jung asked this question with the specific tools of depth psychology, the practice of listening to what the unconscious was generating in dreams, in symptoms, in the strange correspondences between inner life and outer event, and of taking what he found there seriously enough to build a theory around it. His theory was imperfect. He acknowledged this. The concept of synchronicity, as he formulated it, left important questions unanswered. The question of mechanism, the question of frequency, the question of why some moments carried this quality of meaningful convergence and most did not. He proposed the framework not as a finished architecture, but as a provisional map of territory that deserved more careful exploration than the existing scientific vocabulary allowed. Wolfgang Pauli, corresponding with Jung across the years and disciplines that separated them, brought to the same territory the specific strangeness of quantum physics, the genuine non-locality of entangled particles, the irreducible indeterminacy of quantum states, the demonstration that the classical picture of a universe of separate things connected only by local causal chains had to be given up at the level where the physics was most precise. Pauli was not using physics to prove synchronicity. He was doing something more careful and more interesting than that. He was noting that the universe revealed by the most rigorous available science was already stranger, already more interconnected, already less amenable to the neat Newtonian separations than the common understanding of that science tended to acknowledge, and that in this strangeness there might be room for questions that the older physics had no room for. David Bohm, following a different thread from the same tangled territory, proposed his image of the implicate order, the deeper domain in which all things were enfolded into one another, the whole present in each of its parts, the visible surface of separable causally sequential events emerging from a background of genuine hidden wholeness. Bohm was a physicist, not a mystic, and the implicate order was a physical proposal motivated by the mathematics of quantum theory rather than by any desire for spiritual consolation. But the philosophical implications of what he was describing were not confined to physics. A universe constituted by an enfolded wholeness, from which the separateness of ordinary experience emerges as a kind of surface phenomenon, would be a universe in which the meaningful convergence of apparently disconnected events might reflect something real in the deep structure of things rather than something merely perceived. None of this settles the question. The history of thought on this topic is not a progress toward a conclusion. It is a long conversation in which each generation has brought new tools and new languages to a question that has consistently exceeded what those tools and languages were able to hold. The question keeps moving. The territory keeps proving larger than the maps. What remains after the conversation has gone as far as it can go for tonight is the quality of the question itself. The question of whether certain convergences between inner and outer carry a meaning that is not reducible to coincidence, whether the universe is the kind of place in which such convergences could be real rather than merely perceived, is a question that cannot be settled by an argument. However careful, it belongs to the class of questions that Aristotle identified as the origin of philosophy, genuinely open, genuinely important, capable of being held with curiosity rather than with anxiety, generating in the person who holds it, well, not distress, but a particular kind of alertness to the world. The woman on the pavement in the morning city has by now continued walking. The moment has passed into the past, the way all moments do, and she carries it with her in whatever form it has taken in her, as a question or an experience, or a slight and permanent shift in the way she walks through the ordinary day. She does not know and cannot know what the moment was. She only knows that it happened and that it felt significant, and that those two things together are enough to make it worth carrying. There is a thought experiment sometimes used in philosophy seminars that asks a group of people to consider what it would mean for an event to be truly random, genuinely, completely, irreducibly without order or pattern or connection to anything that preceded it. The usual starting point is a coin toss, or a sequence of dice, or some other mechanism constructed specifically to generate outcomes that follow no rule. But the closer one looks at even these carefully randomized systems, the harder it becomes to say with confidence that randomness, in the strict philosophical sense, is actually what they are producing, or whether randomness is a concept that belongs to the map rather than to the territory, a way of describing the limits of human knowledge rather than a feature of the world that knowledge is about. Laplace had believed it belonged to the map, that randomness was a name for ignorance, that a sufficiently complete knowledge of all the relevant causes would dissolve every apparent coincidence into transparent necessity. But the physics of the 20th century found, in the quantum domain, something that looked less like concealed determinism and more like genuine indeterminacy, not an ignorance that better instruments would cure, but an indefiniteness inscribed into the structure of physical reality itself. Heisenberg's uncertainty relations were not an engineering problem. They were a statement about what nature holds prior to the moment of measurement, which turned out to be less than the classical picture had assumed. Into this genuinely open terrain, a universe in which determinism has been dislodged from its foundation and randomness has been found to be, at the quantum level, not concealed order, but something more fundamental and strange. The question of synchronicity arrives not as a superstition from the past, but as a philosophical option that the physics cannot simply rule out. This does not make synchronicity true. The physics does not confirm it, but it removes the automatic confidence of the dismissal, the assumption that only a simple mechanical universe is available, and that within such a universe, meaningful acausal connection is by definition impossible. Hume sat in his study in Edinburgh in the middle of the 18th century and worked through the most careful analysis of causation that had yet been produced, and found at the end of it that causal necessity, the connection between one event and the next that holds them together in the chain the classical picture depends on, was nowhere in experience to be found. He could find the first event. He could find the second. He could find the psychological habit of expecting the second after the first, the mind's disposition toward the sequence, its inclination to project connection onto what might be only succession. But the necessity itself, the link that was supposed to bind them, was simply not available to experience. It was an inference, a projection, a cognitive construction, not a perception. Hume did not intend this as an argument for synchronicity. He intended it as an argument about the limits of empirical knowledge and the nature of induction. But what he found, in the course of a rigorous examination of causation, was that the causal bond was less solid, less self-evidently real than the picture that depended on it had assumed. If causation is a cognitive construction projected onto experience, then the boundary between causal and acausal connection becomes philosophically more permeable than the classical view allowed. The sharp line between the mechanical and the meaningful softens. The question of whether certain events are connected by cause or by meaning becomes, at minimum, a genuinely open one. All of this belongs to the long conversation. The conversation that begins in the oldest observations of birds flying above ancient cities and passes through Aristotle, naming chance with careful precision, and Plotinus describing the invisible threads of sympathy that hold the cosmos together, and Boethius writing philosophy in the last days before his execution, and Hume sitting with causation and finding it less solid than it appeared, and Heisenberg writing down relations that changed what it is permissible to say about nature, and Jung turning from his patient's description of a golden insect to find the correspondent of her dream pressing against the glass. The conversation has not ended. It will not end with this. The questions it carries are among the most enduring questions in the history of thinking about the world, not because thinking has failed to make progress, but because the questions are genuinely hard in a way that cannot be fully dissolved by any single framework, however careful. The mechanical universe and the meaningful universe are not two different answers to the same question, so much as two different orientations toward the same enormous and only partly visible territory. And there is a third orientation, older than either, that the philosophical tradition keeps returning to, not because it resolves the dispute, but because it offers something the dispute itself cannot provide. It is the orientation of wonder, of patient, undecided, genuinely curious attention to the question itself, of the mind that has sat with the difficulty long enough to find it not threatening but interesting, not a problem to be solved and filed away, but a landscape that opens further the more carefully it is walked. Aristotle placed wonder at the beginning of the metaphysics, not as a rhetorical gesture, but as a genuine philosophical claim about the nature of inquiry. Philosophy begins not in certainty and not in skepticism, but in the specific state of mind in which a question is genuinely open and the person holding it is genuinely present to its openness. Thomazine, the alert, patient, undecided attention that asks without yet demanding an answer, that finds in the question itself a kind of company, a person who has lived with the question of synchronicity long enough, who has followed it through the evolutionary arguments and the quantum indeterminacy and the cognitive critique and the clinical observations and the old Stoic claim that a rational order runs through all things. That person does not necessarily arrive at a conclusion, but they arrive at something else, a relationship with the question that is more spacious than the one they started with, an ability to hold the morning's strange convergences with something lighter than certainty in either direction, a tolerance for the open ending that is not the tolerance of someone who has given up, but the tolerance of someone who has decided that the openness itself is worth staying with. The streets outside are quiet now. The traffic that surrounded the woman on the pavement has stilled or moved elsewhere, or is so distant that it sounds like something natural, water or wind. The questions are still in the air, but they are resting in the air, not pressing.